The blade he'd given her was cold against the skin of her palm. It was a practical thing, unadorned iron with a leather-wrapped hilt, meant for skinning game or cutting twine. An exile's tool. He stood in the only doorway of her cramped hut, a figure of absolute stillness, sucking the meager warmth from the room and replacing it with the scent of frozen pine and old power. He was the Alpha King, and this was the edge of his world. Her edge, he had brought the sentence himself. A courtesy, he'd called it, his voice a low resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very timbers of the walls. It was a final, precise assertion of his authority over the one person who had never acknowledged it. By sunrise, Kale said, it was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, like saying the moon would set or the river would freeze. The territory beyond the crooked birch marker was barren and unforgiving. To be cast into it was a death sentence, delivered by exposure and starvation instead of a blade. Cleaner for a king. Ilara looked from the knife in her hand to the hard line of his jaw, shadowed in the flickering lamplight. He had the kind of face that seemed carved from mountain stone, all sharp planes and unyielding angles, his eyes holding the flat, dangerous calm of a winter lake. She had known him her entire life, and she had never once seen him uncertain. "And if I am not gone?" she asked, her own voice, quiet, stripped of everything but curiosity. It was the question he was waiting for. It was the final piece of defiance he had come to crush. "Then I will send something to persuade you." He did not say someone. He said something. It was a deliberate choice of word, meant to remind her of her place, Omega. Less than person. A problem to be removed. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. She placed the knife on the rough-hewn table beside a bundle of dried herbs. The soft scrape of iron on wood, the sound was small, insignificant, yet in the crushing silence between them, it felt as loud as a scream. He watched the motion, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. He was reading her, searching for the fear he expected, the pleading he was accustomed to. He would not find it. The wound she carried was old and scarred over, a place of cold iron inside her that no longer knew how to feel the things he wanted it to feel. He held her gaze for another long moment. A silent war waged in the space of a single breath. Then he turned, a fluid movement of dark wool and leather, and was gone. The doorway stood empty, framing a world of blue-black snow and skeletal trees, gust of wind, carrying the sound of a single snapping twig. Then, silence. She did not move. She waited. An hour passed, then another. The moon climbed, a sliver of polished bone in the ink-dark sky. She heard it before she saw it. The crunch of paws on snow, heavy, deliberate, and solitary. It was not a shifter. It was a true wolf, one of the great, gray beasts that were more legend than reality, said to be the first of their kind, the bloodline from which all shifters flowed. She knew which one it would be, Corvus, his shadow, the one wolf in the entire kingdom that had never known any will but Kale's. The door was still ajar. She did not close it. She sat at her table, her hands resting in her lap, and watched the opening. The great dark head appeared first, low to the ground. Its eyes were molten gold in the lamplight, ancient and intelligent. It regarded her without aggression, without sound. She did not speak to it. She did not offer it food. She did not cower. She simply met its gaze and continued to breathe. She was a fact in this room, just as it was a fact in her doorway. It was enormous, its shoulders as high as the table. It moved with a preternatural grace, its paws making no sound on the packed earth floor. It circled the small room once, its nose testing the air, taking in the sentiver of wood smoke, of drying herbs, of the cold dread that should have been there but wasn't. It stopped before her so close she could feel the heat radiating from its body, a furnace of contained power. It could have torn her throat out in less than a second. It could have dragged her into the snow and been done with its master's bidding. It did not. It lowered its massive head and sniffed at the hem of her worn tunic. Then, with a quiet sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 winters, the great wolf lay down. It curled its body into a dense crescent of muscle and fur, its head on its paws, its golden eyes fixed on her. It was waiting. With her, the hours bled into one another. The lamp burned out, plunging the room into the deep, soft, dark that comes before dawn. She did not light another. She sat in the cold and the quiet, the presence of the beast, a strange, unnerving comfort. At the first hint of gray light, a messenger arrived from the stronghold, a young shifter, his face a mask of nervous duty. He stopped dead 20 paces from the hut, his eyes wide. He had come for a report. He had found an answer he could not comprehend. He sent the one wolf that had never disobeyed him. By morning, it was curled outside her door and wouldn't move. The young shifter had stammered the words out, his gaze fixed on the stone floor of the throne room, unable to meet the burning ice of his king's stare. Cale had not moved, had not spoken. He had simply stood by the high arched window that overlooked the valley, his hands clasped behind his back, the very picture of control, but the stillness was different now. Before it had been the stillness of a predator. Now it was the stillness of a fault line, the ground holding itself together just before it splits open. He dismissed the boy with a flick of his fingers. The silence that descended was absolute. Corvus, his will made flesh and fur, the beast that had torn the throat from a rival alpha without a single command. The wolf that had guarded his sleep since he was a boy, and it had chosen her. The thought was impossible, a piece of a puzzle that did not fit the shape of his world. He had built his reign on certainty, on the unshakable foundation of pack law and the absolute loyalty of his subjects. And Omega? The sentence was carried out. The world continued to turn. These were the pillars of his reality. And in a single night, one of them had crumbled into dust. Valerius entered the room without being summoned. The Lord Counselor was a tall, spare man whose age was impossible to guess. He moved with a quiet economy, his gray robes whispering over the stone. His face was a placid mask, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He was the keeper of the laws, the memory of the pack. He had been his father's advisor and his father's before him. "The Omega remains," Valerius said. His voice was dry as autumn leaves. It was not a question. Cale turned from the window. The morning light was pale and thin, leaching the color from the room, from his face. "I am aware. The law is clear. Her presence taints the territory." She was given until sunrise. "The sun has risen," Cale stated, his voice flat. Valerius allowed a small, thin smile to touch his lips. It did not reach his eyes. "Indeed, and your most loyal servant now guards her door. The whispers have already begun, my king. They say your will is no longer absolute. They say the beast has found a new master." The word master was a carefully chosen poison. It implied Cale had been usurped, not merely disobeyed. It was a seed of doubt planted in the heart of his power. "Send Gavril and Reese," Cale commanded, his voice dropping. taking on a hard, dangerous edge. Tell them to bring her to the border by force if necessary, and have them put the wolf down. For the first time, a flicker of something, satisfaction perhaps, showed in Valerius's eyes. He bowed his head, "As you command." But Cale saw the truth. Valerius had wanted this. He had wanted the escalation. He thrived not on order, but on the precise application of the rules that governed chaos. Alara was a disruption, and Valerius knew exactly how to use a disruption to his own advantage. He was testing the strength of the throne. Cale was left alone again with the silence and the cold light. He sent his two best enforcers, Gavril, a mountain of a man whose size was matched only by his feral temper; Rice, smaller, faster, a killer who moved like a shadow. They were shifters of the highest rank, their loyalty to him forged in blood and battle. They would not fail. He told himself this again and again. But beneath the conviction, a cold sliver of doubt had taken root. He had sent his wolf. Now he was sending his monsters. What would he send when they, too, were returned to him, changed in her hut? Alara heard them coming. Their tread was heavier than the wolf's, more purposeful. She rose and unbarred the door, pushing it open into the stark morning. The air was frigid, smelling of snow and iron. Corvus lifted his great head, a low growl rumbling in his chest, a sound like shifting rock. He did not rise. He simply watched the two figures emerge from the trees. Gavril and Rhys stopped, their confidence faltering as they took in the scene. The great wolf, a creature of nightmare and legend, lay before the Omega's door, not as a captor, but as a sentinel. She was nothing. A slight figure in a drab tunic, her face pale, her expression unreadable. She held no weapon. She showed no fear. "The king orders you to the border," Gavril grunted, his voice rough. Corvus's growl deepened, the fur along his spine bristling. The air grew thick with a sudden, violent tension. "And the beast is to be put down," Rhys added, his eyes darting between Alara and the wolf, his hand resting on the hilt of the long knife at his belt. Alara looked at them. She saw the conflict in their eyes, the brutal certainty of their orders warring with the impossible reality before them. They were weapons, honed and sharpened by their alpha, and they had been pointed at something they did not understand. "He is not my beast," she said, her voice carrying easily on the cold, still air. "He is his own," Gavril scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Now step aside, Omega." He lunged. It was not a calculated move, but an explosion of frustration. He was not trying to get to her. He was trying to break the spell of this place, to shatter the unnatural calm with the familiar language of violence. Corvus moved. He was not a wolf anymore. He was a blur of gray fur and fury, a silent, lethal force that met Gavril in mid-air. There was a sickening crunch of impact, the sound of a large body hitting the frozen ground. Gavril roared, a sound of shock and pain. Rice drew his blade, but he did not attack. He stood frozen, watching as the legendary wolf stood over his partner. Corvus was not tearing at Gavril's throat. He was simply standing over him, his massive paws pinning the shifter's shoulders. A clear and absolute statement of dominance. Gavril struggled, but it was useless. He was utterly overpowered. Rhys looked at Alara. His killer's eyes, usually so empty and cold, were filled with a dawning confusion. She hadn't done anything. She hadn't spoken a command. She had simply stood there watching, and the world had inverted itself. The wolf, the Alpha King's will, had protected the exiled Omega from the Alpha King's own enforcers. Rees slowly, deliberately sheathed his blade. The quiet slide of steel into leather. It was a gesture of surrender, but to a situation that had moved beyond the scope of his orders. He looked at Gavril, pinned and breathing heavily. He looked at the wolf, a statue of deadly intent. And he looked at the woman in the doorway, who seemed to be at the calm center of it all. He understood. They had failed, and they would return to their king, carrying not her body, but this impossible story, this new piece of a puzzle he could not solve. They would return, carrying the scent of her, the quiet stillness of her defiance. They would return changed. Cale watched them approach from the window of his private study. He did not need to hear their report. He could see it in the way they walked. Gavril limping, his arm held stiffly to his side, his usual swagger gone, replaced by a sullen, wounded pride. Rice walking beside him, his gaze distant, his movements lacking their usual predatory grace. They were beaten, not just physically, but spiritually. They had been sent to enforce his will, and had instead collided with a truth that had broken it. Behind them, at a distance, followed the wolf. Corvus moved with his head and tail low, a posture not of submission, but of profound shame. He would not come closer than the outer courtyard. He had disobeyed. He had turned against his own. He was caught between two loyalties, a schism that had never before been possible. The fortress felt colder than usual. The stone walls seemed to leach warmth. The tapestries depicting great victories of the pack seemed like hollow boasts. His authority was a garment, and he could feel the threads beginning to unravel. Valerius was there, of course. He seemed to materialize from the shadows whenever Cale's power was in question. "They have returned empty-handed," the counselor observed, his voice smooth as polished stone. "She has a formidable guardian." Cale turned on him, his control finally snapping, a flare of the raw, primal anger he so rarely showed. "She has my guardian. She has turned my own strength against me." What witchery is this, Valerius? The old laws speak of such things. Omegas with hidden power, curses laid on bloodlines. Valerius met his fury with unnerving calm. The law is simple. It does not speak of witchery. It speaks of contamination. A foreign element introduced into the pack. The body seeks to expel it. When it cannot, a sickness takes hold. The sickness begins with disobedience. It ends in collapse. He was not speaking of Alara anymore. He was speaking of Kyle. He was diagnosing the pack's illness and naming his king as the source. "What would you have me do?" Cale's voice was a low snarl. "Send the entire guard? Burn the forest to the ground to root out one woman. The law demands a clean cut," Valerius said, his eyes cold and clear. "When the hand is infected, you do not send soldiers to fight it. You take a blade and you remove it yourself, to prove the body is still strong, to prove the will of the head still commands the hand." The implication was horrifyingly clear. Go yourself, and this. Prove you are still king. It was a trap, and they both knew it. If he went and failed, his authority would be irrevocably shattered. If he refused to go, he would be seen as weak, afraid of a single Omega. Valerius was using the law, not as a guide, but as a weapon, and it was pointed directly at Cale's throat. He had to go. There was no other choice. He would face her one last time, but this time, he would be seeking an answer. Why was his world coming undone? And why did he have the sinking feeling that she had been waiting for him to ask? He walked, he did not ride. He needed the cold air, the bite of the wind, the hard reality of the frozen ground beneath his boots. He passed through the training yards where shifters stopped their sparring to stare at him, their faces a mixture of awe and confusion. He passed the gates where the guards, men who would have died for him yesterday, now could not meet his eyes. The whispers followed him like a shroud. The walk to the edge of the territory felt longer than it ever had before. The forest was silent, watchful. As he drew closer to her hut, he felt it, a strange sense of peace. The air was still. The crushing weight of the pack's expectation and fear seemed to lessen with every step. It was as if he were walking out of a storm into a quiet clearing. He saw them from a distance, Gavril and Reese. They had not returned to the fortress with him. They were sitting on a fallen log, 100 paces from her door, their swords laid aside. They were not guarding her. They were not threatening her. They were simply present, watching, waiting. The sight was more unsettling than any report of violence. His enforcers, his killers, sitting a vigil for the woman they were meant to destroy. Corvus lay where he had been before, a silent gray guardian by the door. The wolf lifted his head as Kale approached, a soft whine escaping his throat. But he did not move. He would not stand against Kale, but he would not abandon his post. Kale stopped before the door. It was closed. He could smell the faint scent of wood smoke. He stood there for a long time. The Alpha King, the absolute ruler of all he surveyed, feeling like a stranger at the gates of his own kingdom. Finally, he raised a hand to knock. But before his knuckles could touch the wood, the door swung in, the creak of a simple wooden door. Alara stood there. She looked tired, her face pale in the gray afternoon light, but her eyes were clear. She was not surprised to see him. She held a small, carved wooden bird in her hand, her thumb stroking its smooth, worn surface. A gift he had carved for her when they were children, before the world had told them what they were to each other, before he was a king and she was an exile. "You came," she said. It was not a question. "They all failed," he said, his voice raw. "The wolf, the enforcers. They look at you and they forget themselves. They forget me. They do not forget you," she corrected softly. "They remember something else. Something older than their loyalty to a king." She held up the small wooden bird. A kingfisher. He remembered the day he'd given it to her by the riverbank. He had been a boy, full of pride at his small skill. She had been a girl who saw not a future alpha, but just a boy named Ko. "You think this is sentiment?" he asked, a bitter edge to his voice. "A childhood trinket has undone my entire reign?" "No," she said, her gaze steady, unwavering. "This is just wood. It is a reminder. You gave it to me because you saw me. Not an omega, not a designation, just me. Your wolf, your men. They have been living by the law for so long. They have forgotten what it feels like to simply see another creature. All they know is rank, threat, subordinate. I do not offer them that. I offer them nothing. And in that nothing, they see themselves again. The beast inside them finds no enemy here. It finds quiet." He stared at her, the truth of her words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't sorcery. It was something far more dangerous. It was peace. The pack was built on a finely balanced system of aggression and submission, a constant, low-level state of conflict that kept the hierarchy sharp and clear. Her stillness, her refusal to participate in that system, was not a passive act. It was an active dismantling of it. She did not fight the beast. She soothed it. And in doing so, She revealed the deep, festering sickness at the heart of his kingdom, that they had mistaken control for strength and dominance for peace. Valerius says you are a sickness, he said, the words tasting like ash. He says I must cut you out myself. She looked past him, toward the distant peaks where the stronghold stood, a jagged crown of stone against the sky. Valerius does not fear me, she said. He fears a pack that no longer needs his laws. He fears an alpha who rules not by will, but by witness. He fears what you will become if you stay here too long. She stepped back, leaving the doorway open. It was an invitation, an offer, not of fealty, not of love, but of silence, of a place where he did not have to be a king, where he could perhaps be Kale again. He stood on the threshold, caught between two worlds. Behind him was his throne, his law, his power, a kingdom of beasts held in check by fear and force. Before him was a tiny bare hut containing a woman who could tame those beasts with nothing but her own quiet heart. Valerius was right. It was a choice, a clean cut. He could enter that hut and lose his crown. Or he could turn, walk away, and kill the woman who had shown him the truth, preserving a kingdom that was already dead inside. The wind picked up, moaning through the pines, carrying the first flakes of a new snow. He looked at her, at the open door, at the promise of a silence that was more terrifying and more seductive than any battle he had ever fought. He felt the weight of his crown, a cold, heavy circle of iron, and for the first time, he wondered what it would feel like to take it off. The throne room was a cavern of judgment. The entire pack council was assembled, their faces grim and expectant. Valerius stood beside the empty throne, his posture radiating a quiet, predatory authority. He had forced this. He had called for a public reckoning, framing it as a necessary reaffirmation of the law. Kale stood in the center of the room, the great stone doors closed behind him. He had returned from the forest's edge alone. His expression was unreadable. He had not spoken to anyone. The whispers had grown to a roar in his absence, and now they had fallen into a heavy, watchful silence. Every eye was on him. "The Omega still lives," Valerius announced, his voice echoing in the vast space. "She remains on Packlands in defiance of the law, in defiance of you, my king." Kale's gaze swept over the faces of the council. He saw fear, in some ambition, in others. He saw men and women clinging to a structure they believed was immutable, the only thing protecting them from the chaos of the wild. They were all prisoners of the law they claimed to uphold. "The law demands a final answer," Valerius continued, pressing his advantage. "Her existence has sown discord. It has weakened your command. It has compromised the integrity of the pack. As Lord Counselor, I must invoke the oldest statute. The Alpha's duty is to purge any contagion that threatens the whole. You must enact the sentence yourself. You must kill her. Prove to your pack that your will is sovereign. Prove that you are still our king." It was the final move in his carefully orchestrated game, a public ultimatum. Kill the Omega, or be branded a traitor to the very laws you are sworn to protect. There was no third option. No room for debate. It was a perfect trap. Kale looked at Valerius, truly seeing him for the first time. Not as an advisor, not as a keeper of history, but as a jailer, a man so in love with the cage he had built that he would kill anyone who showed him the sky. The silence in the room stretched, becoming thin and brittle. The council held its breath. They were waiting for the roar, for the righteous fury of an alpha whose authority had been challenged. They were waiting for him to call his guards, to take up his sword, to become the monster the law demanded. Kale did none of these things. He met Valerius's cold, triumphant gaze. He held it, and then he slowly, deliberately began to unbuckle the heavy leather sword belt at his waist. The clink of a heavy buckle, the slide of leather on wool, he let it fall to the stone floor. Loud, echoing clatter. Next, he reached up and removed the circlet of dark hammered iron from his brow. His crown, it felt impossibly heavy in his hand. He looked at it for a moment, this symbol of his power, his burden, his prison. He let it drop. It landed with a ringing clang that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. He stood before them, stripped of his weapons, of his office. He was no longer the Alpha King. He was just a man. He turned his back on the throne, on the stunned faces of the council, on the sputtering, disbelieving rage that was beginning to dawn in Valerius's eyes. He did not say a word. There were no words for this. His actions were the only language that mattered now. He walked toward the great doors. His steps were steady, measured. He was not fleeing. He was choosing. He was abdicating. Not just a throne. He was walking away from a kingdom of fear and into an unknown country of quiet, the heavy groan of the throne room doors opening in. He did not look back. He walked out into the cold air of the courtyard, leaving a vacuum of power and a shattered law behind him. The sound of the doors closing echoed through the hall, a final, definitive punctuation. Boom of a heavy door closing, the sound reverberating, then fading into silence. The walk back to her was different. He was lighter. The crushing weight of 100,000 souls, their safety, their laws, their future, was no longer his to bear. The whispers of the pack were behind him now, a storm he had simply walked out of. He was free, and it was the most terrifying feeling he had ever known. He found her hut as dusk was falling, painting the snow in shades of violet and gray. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. The wolf, Corvus, rose to his feet as Kale approached, whining softly, and nudged his head against his former master's hand. The two enforcers, Gavril and Reese, were still there, standing now, as if they had been waiting for him. They looked at him, at his uncrowned head, an empty sword hand, and a slow understanding dawned on their faces. They did not bow. They simply nodded, a gesture of respect for the man, not the title. The door to the hut opened before he reached it. Ilara stood there, a single candle burning on the table behind her, casting her in a warm, gentle light. She had known he would come. She had known the choice he would make. Perhaps even before he had. He stopped a few feet from her, the space between them charged with everything that had never been said, a lifetime of rank and law and distance. He was a man with no name, no title, no land. He had nothing left to offer, nothing but himself. She looked at him, and for the first time since they were children, her eyes held no guard, no wall, no caution. She was seeing him. That was worse than any judgment, more intimate than any touch. It was everything. She held his gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement of the world he had just left behind and the one he was about to enter. Then she stepped aside. She held the door to her small, simple home open for him. It was not a victory. It was not a surrender. It was a beginning. He crossed the threshold, leaving the cold and the snow and the memory of a crown behind. He stepped into the quiet warmth of her world, the sound of a door closing gently, and the click of a simple wooden bar falling into place. Outside, the snow began to fall in earnest, blanketing the world in a fresh, clean silence.